They called him the democratic darling of East Africa, a man who had spent decades championing free elections, human rights, and constitutional reform. Washington embraced him. Brussels praised him. His name, Raila Odinga, was synonymous with the promise that Western-style democracy could take root and thrive on African soil. And yet, standing before cameras, dignitaries, and the watchful eyes of a continent, he shattered that very illusion. "This democracy you speak of," he said with calm precision, "was imported, not inherited, imposed, not invented. And here in Africa, it has failed." The room didn't gasp, it froze. From Nairobi to Ouagadougou, the words spread like wildfire. Not a coup, not a riot, a speech. And yet it carried the weight of a revolution. Odinga didn't just critique the system, he dismantled its credibility, pointing to its cracks both in Africa and in the very nations that created it. Brexit chaos in the UK, the Capitol Hill riot in the US, the erosion of rights in Europe. If democracy is collapsing in its cradle, he asked, why should Africa keep nursing it? It was a question few dared ask in public, yet millions had whispered in private. And it struck a chord in an era where leaders, like Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, have rejected foreign control in favor of bold, unapproved action, expelling troops, reclaiming resources, and building without permission. For older generations, this moment feels like déjà vu, a return to the fiery independence speeches of the 1960s. For Africa's youth, it is a rallying cry for African democracy 2.0, a model rooted in their realities, not someone else's blueprint. So here is the question for you. If the old model no longer serves Africa, what should replace it? Should leaders follow Traoré's path, acting first, explaining later, or cling to a system that promises stability but delivers stagnation? Please share if you feel that you are one of the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traoré. Subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines. The moment that now dominates headlines across Africa did not begin with chaos in the streets or gunfire in the air. It began in the calm of a political forum in a hall filled with diplomats, journalists, and senior African Union officials. Raila Odinga, Kenya's former prime minister, a man who had just endured a bruising loss in the race for AU chairperson, stepped up to the podium. For many, this was expected to be a concession speech, a reaffirmation of unity under the African Union banner. Instead, what followed was a surgical dismantling of an entire political ideology. With deliberate pace and steady voice, Odinga declared that Western-style democracy is not only failing Africa, it was never designed to serve it. He framed it not as an organic outcome of African history, but as a colonial import. In Africa, political democracy is an import from the West. It was never adapted to our traditions, never aligned with our socio-economic conditions. This was no offhand remark. Odinga's speech was structured like an indictment supported by evidence drawn from both African experience and Western decline. He pointed to the ironies of being lectured on democracy by countries now struggling to preserve their own Brexit's divisive politics, the January 6th insurrection in Washington, Hungary's drift toward authoritarianism, France's waves of social unrest. Democracy, he warned, is being rejected, even in its cradle. But his criticism went beyond political theater. He connected the failures of imported democracy to Africa's economic stagnation and structural inequality. He highlighted the low intra-African trade rate, barely 15%, despite decades of integration talk. He spoke of crippling energy costs, where countries like the Gambia pay 38 cents per kilowatt hour, while industrialized economies pay a fraction of that. He pointed to stalled infrastructure projects, the Cape to Cairo Highway, the Lamu Port South Sudan-Ethiopia Transport Corridor, and the Grand Inga Dam as symbols of how bureaucracy and dependency have replaced ambition. These were not abstract grievances. They were daily realities for millions. You cannot speak of democracy, he said, when your people cannot afford to light a room, travel to a job, or export a product to their neighbor. As the audience listened in tense silence, Odinga drew a direct connection between governance and dignity. He argued that Africa's crisis is not simply about elections, term limits, or constitutions. It is about whether political systems can deliver tangible improvements in the lives of citizens. And in that regard, he suggested the imported model has failed. Then came the comparison that electrified the room: Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. Without waiting for AU approval or foreign endorsement, Traoré had expelled French troops, nationalized key mining sectors, and launched large-scale infrastructure projects. He had done what Odinga called build first, debate later. This unapologetic approach, Odinga noted, had won Traore not just domestic loyalty, but admiration across Africa's youth. For Odinga, this was not about endorsing authoritarianism, it was about questioning the double standard that applauds decisive leadership in the West, but condemns it in Africa. He warned that if Africa's youth continue to see elections as meaningless rituals, they will increasingly cheer leaders who bypass the ballot box entirely in pursuit of sovereignty. His speech was not purely a critique, it was also a provocation. He urged African nations to draw from their own traditions of governance, citing the Palava system of community dialogue, and to blend modern tools with indigenous wisdom. The point was clear: Africa must stop trying to fit into someone else's frame and instead build one of its own. By the time Odinga stepped away from the podium, the hall remained silent, not out of disapproval, but from the weight of what had just been said. In less than an hour, a man once seen as a pillar of Western-aligned democracy had become a voice for African political redefinition. His words had crossed a line that many leaders feared to approach, let alone step over. And in doing so, he transformed a routine political speech into a continental turning point. If the opening of Raila Odinga's address was an awakening, the climax was a direct strike at the very heart of Africa's political contract with the West. Standing firm at the podium, he repeated the line that would ricochet across social media, television, and street conversations from Nairobi to Ouagadougou: democracy is being rejected even in its cradle. The words landed like a challenge not just to the gathered diplomats, but to the architects of the global democratic order. He wasn't speaking in metaphors, he was issuing a verdict. And then came the pivot that transformed his critique into something larger. He drew a clear line between his own words and the bold governance style of Captain Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso. Here was a leader who, without permission from Paris, Washington, or Addis Ababa, expelled foreign troops, nationalized gold mines, and launched nationwide infrastructure initiatives. No committees, no endless negotiations, just action. Odinga's comparison was deliberate. In his framing, Traoré's defiance was not chaos, it was clarity. It was what leadership looked like when stripped of colonial hangovers and donor dependency. And in this framing, Odinga was not just criticizing Western-style democracy. He was offering the Sahel's new assertiveness as an alternative blueprint. The audience, still frozen in its seats, understood the implications. This wasn't a fringe activist talking. This was a veteran statesman, a man once championed by the very governments he was now accusing of exporting political fraud. By invoking Traoré, he was aligning himself, if not formally then ideologically, with the continent's most defiant wave of leadership in decades. The reaction was instant outside those walls. Within hours, clips of the speech flooded African youth networks. Hashtags like RT Odinga Unchained and R African Democracy 2.0 trended on X, formerly Twitter. In Dakar, students gathered for public readings of his address. In Accra, lecturers held emergency forums on governance reform. In Nairobi, youth collectives posted side-by-side images of Odinga and Traoré captioned "Two generations, same battle." In Burkina Faso, the government offered no official comment, but state television aired key excerpts of the speech over archival footage of Thomas Sankara, a symbolic handoff from Pan-African past to Pan-African present. In Nigeria and Ghana, opposition politicians began cautiously echoing Odinga's language in parliamentary debates. Across the continent, the speech was no longer just commentary, it was becoming a manifesto. Inside the African Union, the public stance was muted: no resolutions, no applause. But diplomats whispered their unease in private corridors. Some feared the rhetoric could embolden anti-Western sentiment and fracture AU unity, especially between Sahel-led nations pushing for a new charter and coastal democracies clinging to existing ties with Europe and the US. The cracks many admitted off-record were already there, Odinga had merely exposed them. In Western capitals, the speech triggered a calculated form of silence. The U.S. State Department reiterated its commitment to democratic institutions without addressing Odinga directly, a diplomatic tactic some called prudence, others called evasion. In Brussels, officials avoided naming him, but quickly convened policy review sessions. European think tanks labeled the speech populist and destabilizing, even as they privately acknowledged that Europe's conditional aid model was losing its grip. China and Russia wasted no time capitalizing on the moment. Chinese media cast Odinga's remarks as proof that each region should choose its own development path. Russian state outlet RT aired special segments likening Odinga to Traore, calling both symbols of multipolar resistance. Beijing's advantage was pragmatic, while the West debated political theory. China continued building roads, ports, and digital infrastructure, exactly the execution over evangelism Odinga had demanded. Even among Africans who did not fully support his position, there was recognition that something fundamental had shifted. Civil society leaders worried about fueling militarism. Moderates cautioned against abandoning democratic safeguards entirely. Yet they could not deny the truth. At the core of his words, the imported model was failing to meet African needs. For many, the climax of the speech was not just that Odinga broke with Western orthodoxy. It was that he did so without flinching, without hedging, and without offering an easy alternative. Instead, he left the question hanging in the air. If the current model is broken, who will dare to design the next one? And perhaps that more than any policy proposal was what unsettled both the AU and the West, because it implied that the next chapter of African governance might not be written in Geneva, Paris, or Washington, but in the streets of Bamako, the halls of Ouagadougou, and the minds of a generation no longer waiting for permission. The aftershocks of Raila Odinga's speech were felt far beyond the walls where it was delivered. In the days that followed, it became clear that his words had opened two fronts of consequence, one among Africa's citizens and another within its political class. On the streets, the reaction was visceral. For many ordinary Africans, traders in Lagos, students in Nairobi, farmers in Bamako, the speech was more than political theory. It was a mirror reflecting their frustrations. People spoke openly about how elections had become ceremonial, how promises of democracy never translated into paved roads, functioning hospitals, or affordable electricity. In informal markets and crowded commuter buses, the sentiment repeated like a refrain. At least he is saying what we have all been thinking. Youth-led civic groups saw an opportunity. Across West Africa, they began hosting forums on African Democracy 2.0, debating what governance could look like if stripped of donor dependency. Some proposed constitutional models, blending modern structures with traditional councils. Others focused on economic sovereignty, inspired by the bold resource policies of Captain Ibrahim Traoré. But in political halls, the mood was more conflicted. Within the African Union, Odinga's speech deepened existing rifts. Sahel-led governments, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, interpreted his words as validation for their hard break from Western influence. They quietly explored proposals for an AU charter amendment that would give member states more autonomy in rejecting external political conditions. In contrast, coastal democracies with strong EU and US trade ties like Senegal and Ghana viewed the speech as a dangerous gamble that could alienate donors and destabilize fragile economies. This division also played out in domestic politics. Opposition parties in several countries seized on Odinga's words to criticize ruling elites seen as too aligned with foreign interests. In Nigeria, parliamentary debates erupted over whether the country should re-examine its defense agreements with the US and UK. In Kenya, Odinga's own political rivals were split. Some accused him of jeopardizing international partnerships. Others quietly admitted that his critique was overdue. Civil society and human rights groups walked a tightrope. While many agreed that the current democratic model had failed to deliver, they worried that embracing rapid unilateral governance, as in the Traoré model, could erode essential checks and balances. Veteran activists warned that public enthusiasm for decisive leadership could quickly be exploited by would-be strongmen. The tension was clear. People wanted results, but feared the cost of bypassing democratic safeguards. Internationally, the political consequences began to crystallize. Diplomats reported that some AU committees had slowed cooperation with Western-backed programs, citing strategic re-evaluation. Private briefings in Addis Ababa revealed discussions about strengthening intra-African trade blocs and defense pacts independent of NATO or EU frameworks. While no official policy shifts were announced, the mere fact that such conversations were happening signaled a turning tide. For the West, this presented a delicate challenge. US and EU officials were reluctant to confront Odinga directly. Doing so risked confirming his point about Western intolerance for dissent. Instead, they doubled down on behind-the-scenes diplomacy, urging African leaders to keep aid and governance reforms linked. Yet their caution only reinforced a perception, particularly among African youth, that the West had no real answers, only recycled assurances. At the societal level, the most profound consequence was psychological. Odinga's speech normalized a question that had long been taboo. If the current model does not work, why keep it? Once voiced by a leader of his stature, this question could not be unasked. It began appearing in radio call-in shows, church sermons, and university lectures. For a continent with 70% of its population under 35, that shift in mindset may prove more destabilizing or more transformative than any policy change. In short, the political class is now divided. Civil society is both energized and cautious, and ordinary Africans are rethinking what governance means. The West is watching closely, wary that what began as a speech could evolve into a movement, and that movement might not seek permission before reshaping the future. From Washington to Brussels, Odinga's speech was more than a political ripple. It was a warning shot across the bow of the established order. In the United States, the official line was cautious and predictable. The State Department issued a short statement reaffirming its support for democratic institutions and inclusive governance across Africa, but notably avoided mentioning Odinga by name. Behind closed doors, the reaction was sharper. Analysts at think tanks like the Brookings Institution and the Center for Strategic and International Studies (CSIS) described the speech as a credibility rupture. If a veteran pro-democracy figure like Odinga had lost faith in the Western model, they warned America's soft power in Africa was at risk of erosion not through coups or sanctions, but through a steady drain of moral authority. One leaked internal memo reportedly referenced the Burkina Faso effect, the idea that Captain Ibrahim Traoré's unapologetic sovereignty playbook could now spread not only among military juntas, but also among civilian statesmen. "We are not just losing bases," one strategist wrote, "we are losing the ideological high ground." In Europe, the mood was equally uneasy. The European Union avoided public confrontation, instead convening an internal task force to reassess Africa policy. Policy briefs circulated in Brussels admitted in guarded language that the EU's decades-old model offering aid tied to governance reforms and regulatory alignment was losing traction among younger African constituencies. Some European think tanks openly labeled Odinga's remarks populist and anti-globalist, but the speed of their policy reviews revealed an underlying concern the old partnership formula was wearing thin. Meanwhile, Beijing and Moscow saw an opening. Chinese state media framed Odinga's speech as proof that regions should pursue development paths suited to their own conditions, echoing President Xi Jinping's long-standing narrative. Russia's RT network aired segments likening Odinga to Traore, casting both as symbols of a multipolar world defying Western dominance. The difference lay in approach. Beijing offered infrastructure and trade without lectures, while Moscow pushed an ideological solidarity against neo-colonial control. Both approaches resonated with African leaders looking for alternatives to Western conditionality. For the Global South, Odinga's challenge to Western-style democracy dovetailed with a broader trend rising assertiveness in trade diplomacy and security. BRICS plus nations quietly discussed leveraging Africa's shifting mood to accelerate calls for UN Security Council reform and a new global financial architecture less dependent on the IMF and World Bank. The irony was not lost on observers. The same capitals that once celebrated Odinga as a poster child for democratic reform were now recalibrating their engagement to contain the very message he had unleashed. Yet in many African capitals, his speech was not seen as an anti-West tirade, but as a demand for equality, a call for partnerships built on mutual respect, rather than imposed blueprints. In this shifting landscape, the real question for Washington, Brussels, and beyond is no longer whether Africa can be persuaded to stay within the old framework. It is whether they are willing to adapt before Africa decides to build something entirely new without them. Raila Odinga did not march on Parliament. He did not call for barricades in the streets. What he did was far more dangerous to the status quo. He gave voice to the quiet doubt that had been growing across Africa for years. For decades, African nations were told they had arrived because they could vote, because election monitors were present, because their presidents wore tailored suits instead of military fatigues, and yet the roads still crumble, grain still rots at borders, and children still sit in darkness. The world kept insisting this was progress. Odinga's speech fractured that illusion not through chaos, but through clarity. His warning was simple but profound. A political system that cannot deliver dignity will eventually lose its legitimacy. And when that happens, people will turn elsewhere to tradition, to strong leaders, to new alliances, even to risky experiments, because hope must live somewhere. In the Sahel, Captain Ibrahim Traoré has already proven that decisive sovereignty, first governance, can inspire a continent's youth. Whether one agrees with his methods or not, his example forces a question: is slow donor-approved stability worth more than swift, unapproved action that delivers results? This is the crossroads where Africa now stands. Keep walking the well-worn road of imported democracy, one that promises reform but often delivers dependency, or take the uncharted path toward African democracy 2.0, a model rooted in the continent's own history, priorities, and economic reality. The choice is not without danger. Abandoning safeguards can invite abuse. Rejecting the old system without building a stronger one can create chaos. But doing nothing ensures only one outcome: stagnation. And here is where the warning turns global. If Africa redefines its governance on its own terms, it will also redefine its partnerships. Trade deals, military agreements, and diplomatic alignments will shift. The United States, the European Union, China, Russia, all will have to renegotiate not just contracts but assumptions. The geopolitical balance will not wait for hesitant hands. So I ask you, the viewer, especially those who have watched Africa from afar for decades, where do you stand? Do you believe President Ibrahim Traoré's reform strategies are the bold medicine Africa needs, or do you think the continent should seek a more cautious path? History is not rewritten in theory. It is rewritten in the moment when people stop accepting what no longer serves them. That moment in Africa may be closer than the world realizes. Please share if you feel that you are one of the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traoré. Subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines. And most importantly, keep this conversation alive, because sovereignty begins the day silence ends.